From Resilient Partners, this is the Resilient Insights Podcast. Every episode offers in-depth insights on the key debates and conversations shaping Washington and the world. From policy to leadership to the lighter side of life, we're your source for thoughtful discussions. So get ready to be informed, inspired, and engaged. Welcome to the Resilient Insights Podcast. I'm your guide on this journey, Joshua Baca, walking you through the intricate world of public policy, leadership, and the brighter side of life. On today's episode, I'm joined by Georgia political operative Jerry Keene. Jerry is here to share his insights on the battleground state of Georgia and discuss its pivotal role in the 2024 election. Jerry, welcome to the Resilient Insights Podcast.
Thank you, Joshua, and the timing is perfect. Early voting begins today in Georgia and will continue through the entire week leading up to Election Day in November. So we have a very long and robust early voting period, but it does begin today in earnest. The Democrats usually favor pretty heavily in turnout in early voting. I have noticed this year a dramatic increase in get out the vote, early voting vote by Republicans in the state. Several Republican congressmen have put out ads and hit social media. Our media was loaded up with ads leading into today. It's going to be a very close election. And right now, I don't know who would win. I can tell you about some factors that will determine who wins.
Let's dive in right there. This morning, preparing for this podcast, I looked at the aggregate of polls across to see what the spectrum was. Mm-hmm. And right now, 538, which is a polling aggregate and analysis website, has Donald Trump up by 1 point. What's the state of play on the ground? What's the mood? What are voters feeling? And how would you describe the state of the race today?
That poll is right. It could just as easily, you could have said it the other way. As well within the margin of error of any poll. Looking at this race, it's not probably different than most of the other swing states. It comes down to, can Donald Trump capture votes outside the base? How many? 2 years ago, Governor Brian Kemp ran for re-election against Stacey Abrams, a Democrat who was very well funded with national ties, brought in all the national types in here, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, all came in. He soundly defeated her. That race was called before 9 o'clock. And that was a dramatic shift from his previous election that went right down to the wire. But what Governor Kemp was able to do was capture the suburban vote in the North Metro Atlanta, where there is the heavy concentration of what I call young, college-educated suburban voters. And can he, and Kemp has been trying, help convert those voters to turn out for Donald Trump? Now, Joshua, the only elections we have in Georgia this year is we don't have any of our constitutional officers, and we have no U.S. Senate race to drive turnout. It's all legislative races. All of our races are in 2-year cycle, House and Senate, and then local races and congressional. But there's no statewide constitutional elections other than the presidential race. Both camps, both parties are working hard on turnout. If you want a key for election night, begin looking as the rural vote comes in. It's going to be heavily slated toward the Republican candidates. But you have to build a lead that looks like this thing is over to hold on when the metro counties come in. For example, when Fulton County and DeKalb County come in, which are the two largest Democratic voting blocks in the state, they typically come in very late. Some would argue extremely late, but they come in and it tends to flip those numbers down. So we'll take a look at certain counties, see how big the split is between Trump and Harris as the rural counties come in. When North Fulton precincts report, that will give us an idea who's going to win this race.
What are some of the issues dominating the conversation on the ground? Nationally, we hear a lot about the economy and immigration and a host of other issues. Is there anything unique playing out in Georgia animating voters?
No. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on which way you want the race to go, the Kemp-Trump rivalry, or whatever you want to call it, really sidetracked Trump early on. But that has been put to bed. Insiders credit Senator J.D. Vance for working with Governor Kemp to put all that. So there has been, that issue's been taken off the table. Exactly what you said, the economy and immigration are the two things you hear the most. It's the things we hear It's the things that our clients are talking about. The governor in Georgia suspended the gasoline tax because of the hurricanes to give relief. But the price of gas is double what it was when Trump left office. We hear a lot about the price of food, groceries, the supply of those things. The labor market has cooled a little bit, candidly. I think that is first and foremost what I hear. Immigration is talked about predominantly in the Trump base. We don't hear those on the other side talk about it that much. But it certainly is a concern. If you want to put it down to a Georgia issue, we had the case of the young female student at the university that was kidnapped and murdered earlier in the year, and that trial is beginning and underway in Athens over at the university. That ginned up a lot of publicity and triggered a lot of feelings because she was very popular. She was from the suburbs of Atlanta, and it has caused a tremendous amount of concern. So I think those two issues are at the top of the list.
Let's talk about demographics. What are some of the demographic trends or voter trends that are shaping political landscape in Georgia, specifically the demographic trends? What are some of those demographic trends that have made Georgia a swing state and are really shaping the way this election is playing out?
That's what has shaped it, Joshua. The growth of the population in Georgia over the last 10 years, the minority population has grown at a rate double that the Caucasian population or white population has. We have a tremendous amount of influx of not only African American voters, but Latino voters. The Asian community in Georgia has grown at a large rate, particularly in Gwinnett County, a northern suburb that has gone from Republican to primarily Democratic. What's interesting is two new members of the Georgia General Assembly that are Republican that are Asian descent, and they're very conservative. But the growth in the minority population has affected the demographics and voting trends more than any other factor.
Who has momentum on the ground? What's the mood on the ground right now?
I had that discussion earlier this morning. If you'd asked me 10 days ago, I would have said Harris for sure. They tend to mobilize and volunteers and do a lot of things. But this morning, I would tell you Trump's got the momentum on the ground. There's no doubt about it. He's here this week doing a town hall in Forsyth, Georgia, another Republican county. Vance has been here 2 or 3 times. He's coming back. So I think there is a concerted effort on the Trump camp to be here. Harris is coming back too. I think what both camps recognize is neither camp can see a path to victory without Georgia. If Georgia goes either way early in the night, then that just makes Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, all those states, then you almost have to run North Carolina. You got to run the table because Georgia carries that much momentum. Certainly, either camp wins Georgia, then they're looking at picking up another state or 2 or 3 to get to the 270. But both camps are highly engaged. But right now, I sense more discussion, more interest on the ground for Trump than Harris.
What do you think caused that shift?
She hasn't had a great week or so. The campaign has been on defense. Early on, she had all the momentum coming out of the convention. It was the feel good, the candidate of joy. And that was great. And she captured that and rode it as long as she could. But the fact is, there's been some factors happen that have impacted that. I personally think her lack of accessibility to the media and being candid and open on issues has caught her a little bit. Even Saturday Night Live mimicked it in their opening skit. So I think that's hurt her. We've had 2 hurricanes impact Georgia dramatically in the last couple of weeks, and not as much as in Florida, but there seems to be the Harris-Biden camp have split a little bit on the response. President Biden has worked extremely well with Governor Kemp and the state leadership in providing disaster assistance. She's not been seen in that light quite as well. So I think those are the main things. She had all the momentum up till 10 days ago. Now it seems to have gone the other way.
I definitely think that you look at the national trend lines, you see some of the polls that came out this weekend. I think the Wall Street Journal had it tied. Other polls had it within the margin of error, 1 or 2 points. She was up 5 or 6 points a few weeks ago in some of those polls, and she's getting some of that critique that's really beginning to creep into the minds of voters, it seems like. She's not out there making herself accessible. I think you're seeing that trend not just in Georgia, but across the country.
Early voting started today. We had a month. A lot could happen.
Yeah.
There are many things that could impact this thing on a dime. And whether it be something on a national basis or locally in one of the key swing states that can turn the election around in a heartbeat. But I don't know if we'll have more October surprises or not. But the other thing is, and I was talking to a pollster who I'm sure you're familiar with a couple of weeks ago, Trump voters, for whatever reason, typically underpoll. I've heard all kind of reasons, but they significantly underpoll. Sabato had a great article on Harris underpolling both Biden and Hillary Clinton at this same point of those elections. So what that means, I don't know. Who could say? But for whatever reason, the Trump vote does underpoll, and that's also been true here in Georgia.
And whether you agree with it or not, I think the Trump campaign has done a good job in making some concerted effort on building coalitions. They've gone after African American and Hispanic men in particular. You see that gap has closed. They're not only are they underpolling of where President Biden was at this point and where Hillary Clinton was at this point, but they're underperforming against some key demographics, which will be difficult for them to win on election day.
And if you're in the Republican camp, you only have to impact those votes a little. You don't have to win them. Just reduce that amount of votes going their way 3, 4, 5%. And the next thing you know, you flip the election. I don't know early voting trends and polls of who voted for who, and that hasn't been exactly reliable the last couple, 3 cycles. People have settled into early voting now. They understand it. The people that are going to vote early are going to vote early. The people that are not going to vote early are going to election day. My wife, who's very political, votes on election day. She looks forward to it every 2 years. She enjoys it, and that's her thing. She said, I'm voting on election day. So we'll just, I don't know that we can draw any conclusions on reporting on who's winning or losing the early voting.
I share your wife's sentiment. I'm one of those voters that something special about going on election day, getting your cup of coffee, waiting in line. Let's quickly drill in on the coalition side of this. You talk about how the Trump campaign they don't need to win those demographic votes, but chip away at the margin. What are some of the coalitions that are engaged in Georgia right now on the Trump campaign that you see motivating the turnout? What are some of the coalitions on the Harris campaign that you see that are motivating turnout?
On the Harris side, there is I don't know if it's an official group, the Republicans for Harris group. Our former one-term Lieutenant Governor, Jeff Duncan,
Yep.
a Republican, has spearheaded that. He's been across the country campaigning for her. They have worked hand in hand with the Harris campaign, particularly in those northern suburbs. He comes from there to generate or either the turnout for Harris or get them to voting booth and skip Trump and vote for their congressperson and legislator for local. That on the Harris side, that's probably the biggest one. On the Republican side, it's probably less official. The Faith and Freedom Coalition, Ralph Reed's organization, which is based here, very heavily involved in the faith community. They were getting registrations and now translating that toward turnout. Former U.S. Senator Kelly Loeffler has an organization and invested a tremendous amount of resources in voter turnout. She did so for Brian Kemp 2 years ago. It's a huge success. Probably the most successful Republican voter turnout effort in the history of the state. She is engaged on the other side. They have worked extremely hard in traditional voting communities to build support. I think you said it earlier, particular in the African American male community. I sense it. I've heard it from members of that community. They liked it. They thought their finances were better and their world was better when Trump was president. They said they're not going to vote for her. They have worked on that and brought people to speak to that voting bloc, which is pretty large. Part of that is too, though, in that community, the African American male vote is substantially below the African American female vote. If you look at news clips or rally clips from Democrats, particularly in Georgia, you're going to see a heavy concentration of females. And so part of the Trump and Loeffler activity has been to engage that male voter, get him registered, get a ballot, and make sure they vote.
Let's talk about the popularity of Governor Kemp. You mentioned he ran successfully for re-election. He's mended bridges with President Trump. How significant is his presence in the race right now? And does he have the political willpower to push President Trump over the finish line?
Yes. He is arguably the most popular sitting governor in Georgia. Governor Kemp came through a unique time. He came through the pandemic and some other things that other governors around the country had to face. He came out stronger politically than when he entered it and rode that wave. DeSantis gets a lot of credit in Florida for opening first, but Kemp was ahead of him, opening our businesses and allowing the public back to the marketplace and do some things that they were used to doing. And he caught a lot of grief from Trump at the time. Trump was president, if you'll remember, at a press conference. Trump called him out and said, I don't agree with it. I've talked to him. And Kemp said, sorry, but our people need to go back to work and get their lives back. He hit that suburban voter, the mom whose kids were not going to school, the mom who had a job and the husband that has a job, and they needed to get back to work. He galvanized that support and has done an absolute brilliant job of walking that pretty thin line of being a very hardcore conservative, which he is, but not seen as crazy or way out there on the fringe. He governs very conservatively, but his messaging and mannerisms are moderate.
He has definitely seen his national profile grow over the last several years. What do you think his future looks like?
I don't know. We all discuss that occasionally. I think it's up to him. I think it could be what he wants to be. Senator Ossoff's term is up. He's first term U.S. Senate that ran in that 6 years ago in the Trump runoff here in Georgia. I think he could run for that seat, and candidly, if the election were today, he would win that. He would defeat Ossoff if he ran against him today. 2 years is a lifetime. Whether he wants to take 2 years out of office and build his national profile and consider something on a bigger stage, he certainly could. He's created an organization to fund that and do that. We'll just see. I don't know. I think there's some things outside of politics that he potentially could have an interest in and be very good at. But for him, that's up to him. Whatever he chooses, he'll have a tremendous amount of support, both financially and from the popular vote.
Give our listeners and our viewers a little bit of insight to what the upcoming state legislative session looks like in Georgia.
Boy, this will be my 31st session, either as I served there for 10 years and then working in an operative and lobbying role after that. I think it'll be fairly quiet. I don't see a lot of big, heavy issues. We've had a lot of election voting issues come up in the last few General Assembly sessions, revising our election laws. You'll probably get some more of those. We have 180 House members and 56 senators. All of them can introduce a bill anytime on any subject. There's always a flurry of bills introduced with a handful making it through, but you may see some gun legislation, as we had the shooting here in Georgia up in the north part of the state. So you'll probably see some gun control legislation introduced. As to what the governor will do, I don't know. He's indicated he wants major tort reform, which the Business and Insurance Committee is screaming for. What I will tell you is that's a high hill. The last major tort reform bill passed in 2005. I was the House Republican Majority Leader at the time, and we passed it by one vote, and that was the Speaker of the House casting that vote from the chair. Since that time, the trial bar in Georgia has become very active in Republican politics. In fact, the largest single contributor to legislative races 2 years ago. So they have a tremendous amount of influence and sway in the Republican caucus. And anything major that would impact that industry is going to be tough to negotiate. But he has taken it on. He's done a number of hearings. We're all waiting to see what his legislative package looks like. That'll probably be the biggest battle front and center.
You've been summoned to meet with Vice President Harris and President Trump, and they want you to give some insights on what they should do over the next 20 plus days for election. What's your advice for them?
For Vice President Harris, be candid. Sit down, talk to her voters, just plain and simple, and answer the questions without the talking points and be clear and concise as she can be, because a lot of people still don't know who she is. They think she's a nice person, right? But they don't know who she is politically. For President Trump, it's pretty simple. Try not to say or do anything really dumb. Just stay focused on the issues. Say, look, here's what I did 4 years ago, and here's what I'm going to do if you send me back. and stay out of everything else. I don't care how much you're baited, and they're going to try. But I know if I'm in that Harris camp, I'm poking him every day, trying to get him to say or do something.
Jerry, tell us about your background. How did you get involved in politics? Talk a little bit about your time in the state legislature. Give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background about yourself.
Was really interested in politics at a very young age, was a Ronald Reagan volunteer back in the 80s, and then got involved in Republican politics here in Georgia. In the late 90s, I was invited to a lunch to meet with Steve Forbes. He had run for president in 96 and was asked to join his team he was putting together for an organization called Americans for Hope, Growth, and Opportunity, an issue organization, which basically was a forerunner to a presidential campaign for 2000. So I worked in that organization for a couple of years leading up to the campaign, then joined the Forbes campaign as National Coalitions Director. When that campaign ended in late February, when it was obvious Bush was the nominee, the state legislative seat for my home on the coast of Georgia opened up, and I was encouraged to run, and I ran. Back then, Democrats controlled the state house for 132 years. In 2004, we won a majority for the first time since Reconstruction. I became the first House Republican majority leader, served in that role for 6 years, had enough of electoral politics in 2010, went out with Governor Perdue, and then got in the public affairs business then, have been in it ever since. I've been around state politics a long time now, longer than I can really want to admit, but I've seen a lot of changes, dramatic changes. But this is when first elected, Republicans had metro seats, and that was it. In the House, we had 72 out of 180 seats. Rural Democrats controlled the state capitol. Flip it. Rural Republicans control the state capitol now, and the Democratic strongholds primarily are in the metro Atlanta area. So we've seen rural voters transition from traditionally heavy Democratic voters over to Republicans in the last 20 years, and that shaped the Republican majority of the state.
I have two quick questions for you. You are the third installment on my series on this podcast talking about the battleground states and what local operatives and public affairs officials like you are seeing on the ground. Everyone to date in Pennsylvania and Nevada and now Georgia, they all claim that their state is the battleground state. Care to respond to those comments?
No, because as the sequence of election night unfolds, each of us may be true. Those are not, because Georgia's vote generally will come in before those states. North Carolina could possibly come in earlier, but I could not disagree, because as it unfolds through the night, each of those states become more critical for the campaigns to win. But this I can tell you, whoever wins Georgia almost assuredly will be the next president.
Final question. We do something fun on the Resilient Insights podcast where we ask our guests to basically pick a song that we could add to our Resilient Insights playlist. What's a song that captures your mood today, the mood on the ground, the amount of time you have left before election day that you're playing on your iPod or your iPhone today?
That's interesting. I'm a country music fan from way, way back. And so listen to a lot of country music, but I recently watched the Toby Keith tribute. I've been playing a lot of Toby Keith. Any of his songs that ginned up a lot of political fervor right now, I'm listening to a lot. Of course, the post 9/11 song he wrote. But based on how long I've been doing this, it's probably, I'm not as good as I once was, but I'm as good once as I always was. That's probably the one that matches my attitude right now.
That's a good one.
And I think for the candidates, both Vice President Harris and former President Trump, they got one more shot at them, and this is probably it for both of them.
Yeah, 100%. Jerry, I want to thank you for being on the Resilient Insights podcast today. For all our listeners and our viewers out there, be sure to give us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. This is our third installment in a series regarding the presidential race and the various battleground states, and we'll be bringing more to you over the next coming weeks. So make sure you go back and watch and listen to those episodes. Jerry, until next time, thank you to all our listeners and viewers. Keep on listening.
Thanks, Josh.
And I just can't see the path before me.